guys! Remember to subscribe!
Chapter 1. Something New in the Castle. The first rays of the sun streamed through the tall windows of Lumbria Castle's grand hall. Dust danced in the air, caught in the light like tiny sparks of magic, but Elian did not notice. She stood before her writing desk, where a strange package lay, small yet carefully wrapped in dark blue cloth, tied with a silver ribbon. There was no sender's name, only her own, written in elegant, almost enchanted handwriting, to Princess Elian. Use with care. She reached out, hesitant yet curious. The fabric felt cold beneath her fingers, as if it concealed something far greater than itself. When she loosened the ribbon and folded the cloth aside, a wave of intoxicating scent rolled through the room, a blend of lavender and something electric that made the air softly hum. Inside the package lay a small crystal, clear as mountain air, but with a core of violet light pulsing like a beating heart. Elian hesitated. She lifted the crystal, and at once its glow intensified. She felt warmth surge through her arm into her chest like a gentle embrace, but also something that pressed inward. Suddenly the room flashed white, and a faint gasp escaped her lips. Her body hummed, her thoughts grew heavy, and in that same instant she felt a pulling force from deep within herself, as if something were drawing her upward from the inside. Her eyes widened, not in fear but in awe. Her fingers trembled, and she had to brace herself against the desk. Her feet shifted uneasily on the marble floor, and it felt as though the floor itself moved beneath her. Quietly, her body began to stretch, at first almost imperceptibly. Her head lifted, her shoulders suddenly closer to the ceiling than before. Her clothes felt slightly tight. The sleeves slid up past her wrists. She straightened her back, and there was a small crack, not painful, but unmistakable, as if the room itself responded to her transformation. Outside the door, guards patrolled the corridors, unaware of what was unfolding behind the thick wooden door. But it did not last long. A dull thump sounded as Elian's knees struck the edge of her bed, now suddenly far lower than she remembered. She had to bend to make room. The furniture seemed to retreat without moving, as if silently protesting her growing presence. A guard called out, "Is everything all right in there, Your Highness?" But Elian could only whisper, "Yes, I think so." Her voice sounded deeper, mightier, almost like an echo in a mountain cavern. She felt her feet press harder into the floor, felt the stone give just a little. The walls began to creak, a low, ominous groan. The soldiers looked around, shouting to one another in alarm. "Something's happening! Get people out of the castle!" Voices scurried through the corridors like panicked mice. Meanwhile, Elian continued to grow. Slower now, but inevitable. Her face neared the ceiling of the room, the curtains dragged against her elbows. Her hair spilled over the furniture like waves of amber, and her gown, now stretched to its limit, was on the verge of tearing. She sank into a crouch, trying to make space, but the room felt like a cage, built for someone she no longer was. The sounds outside swelled, shouts, running footsteps, bells ringing in the tower. Servants pulled children and the elderly along with them. People in the city began to gather and point up at the castle windows, where something inexplicable now thundered behind the walls. Elian looked at her hands, now larger than the books on her desk, her ring nearly slipping from her finger. Her heart pounded, both with fear and with a strange, uneasy thrill. She caught her own reflection in the large mirror, a giant girl squeezed into frames far too small, still growing, but the castle still held. Marble and stone groaned, yet did not give way, yet. And Elian remained there, knees drawn to her chest, eyes wide and shining. She knew this was only the beginning. The magic pulsing through her veins was far from finished with her. Chapter 2. Stone, Fabric, and Moans. Morning lay heavy over Lumbria, the castle's walls still humming with the unrest of the night. Outside, knights marched back and forth with restless steps, the air thick with questions and fear. But no one was prepared for what was to come. A deep, rumbling boom echoed from Elian's tower chamber. At first they thought it was thunder, but it was too close, too alive. Suddenly, the stones along the foundation began to tremble. The knights looked at one another in alarm, grabbed their swords, and ran toward the sound. Behind the thick walls, Elian struggled with a sensation both unknown and overwhelming. The warmth from the crystal had spread like a wave, growing with every heartbeat. She felt the floor press up against her legs. Her feet were now wider than the castle's rugs, her toes sliding across the smooth stone, shattering porcelain vases in their path. She tried to stay still, but her body was like a river that knew only one direction: upward, outward, larger. With a clattering crash, first her bed split apart, then her writing desk, shattered by knees that were now like pillars in the center of the room. The chandelier swayed, sprinkling crystal dust over her shoulders, but she barely felt it. Every movement made the walls groan, the furniture slide away, the floor shudder. A beam of sunlight cut through the window, sliding across her face and catching the moment when one of her feet slipped beneath the wall. With a resonant, desperate roar, cracks shot like lightning through the stone. Knights on the outside staggered back, eyes wide, as Elian's bare foot pressed through and shoved an entire gate from its hinges. Dust and chunks of stone rained down. People fled screaming. She? She's breaking out. Get everyone out of the courtyard, one of the knights shouted, his voice trembling as much as the ground. Inside the castle, Elian wrestled with her own senses. She should have been afraid, should have screamed, but it was as if her entire body were bathed in a sweet warmth. Her heart beat with a soft, deep rhythm that spread to her fingertips and toes. A faint, drawn-out moan escaped her, quiet yet filled with longing, like a sigh from the very source of magic itself. She grew again. Her hips slid up over staircases, crushed railings, and her hair spilled down the walls like a waterfall of amber. Her clothing, magical and woven from the kingdom's oldest enchantments, yielded, stretched, and grew with her, the fabric forming beautiful folds even as her shoulders struck the ceiling. She looked down. Where the floor had once been a landscape of rugs and furniture, there were now only small fragments beneath her thighs. She felt her legs continue to grow, pushing walls outward, cracking the ceiling. For a moment she paused, breathing heavily, feeling every single cell in her body scream to become even larger, even freer. A window burst open, glass exploding out into the garden as her elbow pushed into the courtyard. Outside, people shouted, but their voices were drowned out by the deep roar of stone breaking apart. Her feet, large as siege stones, slid forward through the ruins, and the entire castle swayed as if begging for mercy. She let out a moan, this time louder, more involuntary. The warmth grew, almost too much, yet irresistible. She threw her head back, felt bricks and roof tiles slide from her hair. With one final deafening surge, she grew even faster, her head slamming into the ceiling, shoulders and back bursting through the walls. An entire wall collapsed, stones raining down over the courtyard like hail. Elian tumbled out of the castle, her body rolling over the ruins in a storm of sound, stone shattering, wood screaming, glass pulverizing. Knights and townsfolk stood frozen, tiny and speechless, like ants beneath the birth of a new world. They looked up at her as she lay half upright amid the fallen walls, breathing hard, her skin bathed in dust and sunlight, her hair flowing like a river over the remnants of the throne hall. She lifted herself onto one elbow, slowly, like a mountain stirring. She drew a deep breath, and the entire valley seemed to hold its breath with her. Her clothing still covered her body, magnificent, shimmering, and completely intact. Magical fabric, as if it would grow with her forever. She looked down. Everything she had known now lay crushed beneath her, yet in her chest the magical, honeyed warmth still glowed. No fear, only fascination, strength, and something new growing deeper than any wall could ever contain. The castle had fallen, but the princess had only just begun to grow. Chapter 3. The Small Lookup. The city of Lumbria lay quiet that morning. People had gathered in the square, staring uneasily up at the old castle walls, which had always been a symbol of protection and royal calm. But today, the air was electric, filled with a fear no one had ever known before. The first tremors began almost imperceptibly, but quickly grew stronger, a slow, deep rumbling that made window panes rattle and lanterns sway in the gusts of wind. A cobbler's apprentice, no older than 16, stood with his mother and looked up. "Mother, why is the castle shaking like that?" She placed a protective hand on his shoulder, but could not answer. For now the sounds were clearer, stone giving way, towers groaning, a deep, almost human sigh, like a distant moan from within the building itself. Some children began to cry. Older men removed their hats and murmured prayers. Soldiers in the castle square shouted orders. "Back! Everyone back!" They pushed people away from the gate, but no one dared turn their back on what was happening. Everyone had to see, for something unheard of was unfolding. Suddenly, an entire corner of the castle was hurled outward with a thunderous, thunderous crash. Bricks and timber rained down as if the mountain itself were exploding. A gigantic bare foot, almost white, with a pink heel, pressed through the wall, huge as an ox cart. A woman gasped and dropped her basket. Bread rolled across the cobblestones. Knights in armor fled, tiny beneath the growing shadow. All eyes were dragged to the next sight, an elbow so massive it crushed an entire balcony railing. A leg, covered in shimmering fabric, shoved a whole tower aside like a pile of toys. People stood frozen. They watched as the walls could no longer hold, and as the entire castle seemed to twist to make room for something impossibly large. Then the sound came again, this time clearer, soft yet powerful. A moan, warm and almost blissful, whispered over the city, as if a giant woman were drawing a deep breath just beneath their feet. Men and women glanced uneasily at one another. It felt like something they should never have heard, as if the whole world for a moment turned into a single, endless shiver. They saw, in one dizzying instant, their princess, Elian, fighting free of the last rubble. Her face, larger than any wagon, turned up toward the sun. Her eyes shone, not with fear, but with something strong and compelling. Her hair, chestnut brown and wild, lay like a waterfall over the collapsed halls. She rose to her knees among the ruins, towering far above all the rooftops. Her clothing hung magnificently on her body, even now, when she could have carried the entire city's people in her hand. People gasped and fell to their knees, some in terror, others in awe, for no one had ever seen anything like this before. A small girl clutched her doll and whispered, "Is that really the princess?" Her father pulled her close, unable to tear his eyes from the gigantic figure. Elian looked out over the crowd, her gaze searching, not threatening, but longing. She was a giant now, but in her eyes one could still glimpse the same goodness and gentleness she had always had. The people stood silent, as if time itself had stopped. Everywhere, voices whispered through the streets. Some cried, some pleaded, but most were simply quiet, caught in the moment when their world changed forever. For there among the ruins, bathed in dust and sunlight, sat the princess, no longer a girl of flesh and bone, but a living legend, one had to look up to, and whose name would now be whispered with equal parts fear and fascination for many generations to come. The castle had fallen, but a new giant had risen in its place. Chapter 4, Tears Over Ruins. The dust still lay heavy over the ruins, but the world felt different. Princess Elian sat for a long time among the collapsed walls, her body so enormous that she cast a shadow over nearly half of the castle courtyard. Small figures gathered at the edge of what had once been the gate, their faces pale, eyes wide with both fear and fascination. Slowly, like a dreamer waking, Elian lifted herself up. Her hands rested heavily on the ground, and when she finally stood, it was like watching a mountain rise from the valley. Her gaze first drifted down over the remains of the castle, towers crushed like toys, walls flattened beneath her legs, and then out over the crowd, almost forgotten within her shadow. The warmth of the transformation still glowed inside her, like sunlight on a winter night. She felt a strange mix of strength and vulnerability, and suddenly her eyes stung. A tear, a drop the size of a man's hand, slid down her cheek and splashed onto the courtyard with a wet, resonant sound. A soldier leapt for his life and barely made it away, while others stood frozen in astonishment. More tears followed, heavy and unstoppable, each one a small rainstorm for those on the ground. The knights and the general, Sir Gawain, her lifelong protector, dared to move closer, even as several were nearly struck by the massive tears. Sir Gawain shouted, "Your Highness," waving the soldiers back as he himself came as close to her knee as he could, positioning himself beneath the fall of her tears. Elian looked down, her lips trembling. She slowly sank into a crouch, trying to make herself as small as possible, but even seated she was still nearly as tall as the castle wall had once been. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice rumbling like thunder yet soft as silk. I don't know what happened. Everything just grew, and it felt so good. I couldn't stop it. I don't understand." Sir Gawain reached upward, as if he could touch her hand, even though it was far above him. "Your Highness, we will figure this out. Together. I promise." His voice was steady, but gentle. She looked down at the general, her eyes wet yet full of trust. There was a crystal. It felt magical. I don't know why, but it filled me with a kind of joy. It was as if I was lifted out of myself. But now, she pointed toward the remains of her chamber, where the crystal still lay among broken stone and scattered books. Sir Gavin turned and gave a sharp order. You three, find the crystal, but do not touch it. Under no circumstances, do not touch it. The soldiers nodded and ran into the rubble, their figures disappearing behind her enormous feet. He turned back to Elian, placed a hand over his chest, and bowed his head. We will find a way, Your Highness, but for now, you must try to relax. We are here. We will not leave you. Elian took a deep, shuddering breath. She felt the pressure slowly ease as the sun began to break through the cloud of dust. She sat there, still colossal, but surrounded by those she trusted. She allowed herself to be comforted, let her shoulders sink, and for the first time since the magic began, she felt not only the warmth, but also safety, and a growing belief that she was not alone in this new world. Chapter 5. A Giant in the City. The crystal lay where it had fallen, in the middle of the remains of the princess's chamber, surrounded by shattered furniture and torn rugs. 3 soldiers approached it carefully, their gazes flicking nervously between the pulsing light and Elian's gigantic figure outside in the ruins. General Gavin waited nearby, his eyes never straying far from the princess herself. We have it, General, one of the soldiers shouted, holding the glowing crystal up with the cloth wrapped tightly around it. The crystal cast flashes of violet light across the rubble, as if it lived a life of its own. The general nodded sharply. Good. No one touches it until we know more. We must find a sage or a wizard who understands this kind of magic. Meanwhile, outside, Elian was no longer lost only in fear and guilt. Something new bubbled up within her, a rising curiosity, a childlike joy in feeling the sunlight on her skin, the wind around her shoulders, and all the little people staring up at her in amazement. She lifted herself up, every movement a study in care and strength. Her body cast shadows that swept across rooftops. The townsfolk stood in streets and squares, pressed together, but few fled. They were far too overwhelmed to do anything but stare. She placed one foot carefully down between 2 houses, letting her toes glide lightly over the stones without destroying anything. The walls trembled, but held. The children were the first to recover from the shock. They gathered in small groups, looked up at her with wide eyes, whispered and pointed, while brave voices called out, "Look, it's the princess! Look how big she is!" Elian smiled, first cautiously, then wide and warm. She crouched down and reached her enormous hand toward them. "Would you like to try?" she asked gently, her voice ringing like distant church bells, yet filled only with kindness. A few children hesitated, but a boy with freckles and curly hair jumped forward. He looked up, stretched his arms toward her, and she lifted him into her giant hand like a mother lifting a newborn. More children followed, grabbing her fingers, laughing as she let them climb up, from where the entire city opened beneath them like a new land. The adults stood speechless. Many could do nothing but watch, make the sign of the cross, or pinch their arms to be sure it was not a dream. But Elian was gentle, her gaze soft, and her playfulness was contagious. She slowly raised her hand with the children so they could see all the way to the city gates. She carefully turned them around, while laughter and shouts of joy echoed across the square. For a moment, she almost forgot her sorrow. Each time she moved, she took her time to greet, wave, and listen to the small voices asking to come closer. She relaxed, her shoulders lowered, her breathing became light and calm. The townsfolk slowly began to approach. A woman reached up and gently touched her finger. An old man smiled and bowed deeply, as if he had never seen anything more wonderful. Behind her, the general kept the crystal hidden, and the soldiers were already on their way to fetch a sage. But in the center of the city, among children, sunlight, and play, the princess and her people forgot for a moment all the dangers of magic and everything they had lost. For the first time, it did not feel like a curse, but like a gift, an adventure where the whole world lay open to those who dared to look up. Chapter 6. Hunger and Shadows. A week had passed since Princess Elian became a giant and brought the castle walls crashing down. Each day the city woke to the sound of her hungry stomach, deep and rumbling like thunder. She often lay in the meadow outside the city, curled up as best she could, her feet dipping into the river while her head rested among the trees. Even the largest breakfasts, loaves of bread, cheese, fruit, and platters of vegetables, became only a few mouthfuls for her. People gathered and watched in silence, some curious, others afraid. The children laughed when she smiled and waved, but parents pulled them close, as if she were a storm that could break loose at any moment. Elian did everything she could to show her goodness. She spoke gently, bent down carefully, and tried not to destroy more than she rebuilt. When the city needed help, she lifted fallen columns, carried stone walls back into place, and gathered roof tiles 2 fingers at a time. Her gigantic hands stacked planks like toothpicks, and she tried to turn the work into play, especially when children were watching. Still, her stomach rumbled again and again like an uneasy drum, and with every growl, people forgot her smile and saw only a hungry, frightening creature. Fear grew in Lumbria. The counselors met in secret, whispering about what might happen if the transformation could not be undone. Soldiers increased their patrols, and each day General Gavin had to convince both the people and his own men that Elian was still their princess. On the 4th day, a messenger arrived, sweat on his brow. He carried word from the capital's sage. Wizard Armandus is on his way. He may be able to break the curse, but it will take 3 weeks before he arrives. A wave of relief swept through the city, but also unease. Could they endure that long? What if something went wrong? Could a giant truly survive on so little? As the days passed, rumors grew like weeds. Some claimed that neighboring towns had begun gathering soldiers in the forests, that scouts had been sent to see whether the stories about Lumbria were true. An old woman in the square swore she had seen foreign riders hiding at the forest's edge, while children whispered tales of giants who devoured villages. Elian felt it too. When she sat down, she could see people move away. When she smiled, they saw only her large teeth. And when her stomach growled, they forgot all the good she had done. But she refused to give up. She tried to keep her spirits high, played with the children whenever she dared, and did everything she could to help the city rise again. In the evenings, she sat watching the sun set behind the mountains, alone with her thoughts, hoping the wizard would arrive soon, and that Lumbria would learn to see her as more than just a giant. On the horizon, real shadows were beginning to gather. Neighboring towns spoke more loudly. People listened to the rumors, and everyone knew that the hour of change was drawing near, though no one yet knew whether it would mean salvation or danger. Chapter 7. The Darkness Within. The nights had grown long and cold. Elian lay in the meadow outside the city, curled beneath the stars, and even the moon seemed afraid to meet her gaze. Hunger crept beneath her skin like a living shadow, growing with every hour, with every careful meal she denied herself. Each time she looked out over Lumbria, she could feel her vision betray her, rooftops turning into loaves of bread, fields into cakes, as if her senses mocked her, turning the entire world into a laid table for a giant. She shook her head, trying to swallow the urge, but it only grew worse. People she had known all her life began to look like small, fragile fruits to her. She caught herself licking her lips and quickly turned her gaze away, fear spreading through her heart like poison. General Gavin found her where she lay alone, curled inward, her eyes fixed on the ground, hands clenched around her knees. He walked close, unafraid, without hesitation. "Elian," he said quietly, his voice strong in the night, "I have known you since you were little. You are not a monster." She trembled. Tears rolled down her cheeks, large and salty, dripping onto the grass and forming small pools beneath her. I can't do this anymore, Gavin. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I see them. I feel it, as if I could eat them if I'm not careful. What if I lose myself?" The general's voice grew firmer, almost angry, yet full of warmth. You won't. You won't. You are still the princess, our friend. You chose not to do harm even when you could. That is what makes you strong. You are more human now than you have ever been." She clenched her hands tightly and stared at her own giant fingers with a mix of terror and grief. "But I can't stay. I have to leave, Gavin. I love them too much to remain. If I stay here, I can't trust myself." Gavin placed his hand against her massive knuckle and looked up at her with grave resolve. "You are not running away, Elian. You are protecting us, as you always have. Hold on." The wizard is almost here. Just one more week. But Elian could not listen. With her vision blurred by tears, she rose, her form towering against the stars, dark and majestic. Her stomach growled deeply, yet she let her hand pass once more over the city, not as a threat, but as a blessing. Then she began to walk away, away from the fires, the children, and those she loved. Each step sent small tremors through the ground. She had barely reached the first farm, intending to hide herself in the night, when she heard the sound of iron against stone and saw lights on the horizon. The darkness of the forest was pierced by hundreds of torches, spears, and banners. A massive army stood assembled on the plains outside Lumbria. Soldiers and riders so numerous she could not count them, even with her new vantage. One of their generals rode forward on a great steel horse and spoke through some kind of amplifier, his voice echoing across fields and valleys. "Hear us, people of Lumbria. We have come to destroy the monster that threatens the world, and all who aid her." Elian froze, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Behind her, panic swept through the city. People fled toward their homes. Knights drew swords and bows, while General Gavin shouted orders and struggled to keep the troops together. In the darkness, at the edge of the city, Elian now stood alone, torn between hunger, fear, and love for her people. She wiped the tears away with a palm as large as a barn door and braced herself for the night, where anything could happen. Chapter 8. The Battle for Lumbria. Inside the city, a rush swept through the streets as the shouts from the fields hit them like a storm. General Gavin stood in the middle of the square, surrounded by soldiers and council members, raising his hand to call for silence. "Prepare yourselves," he shouted. "No one is to harm the princess, but we must protect Lumbria." Fear flashed in every pair of eyes, and yet they stepped forward, ready to fight for their home. Outside the city gates, where darkness still lay heavy over the fields, Elian stood with her back straight. Her giant body towered high, lit only by torches and moonlight. She could hear the army shouting, feel their fear, and yet her gaze was soft, not threatening. She stepped forward with her hands raised in peace, and her voice rolled gently across the plains, deep and resonant. "Stop! I am not dangerous. I will not harm any of you. I know how I look, but I am still your princess. I was struck by magic, by a crystal. I only want to go home. I only want to be your protector." But the army's general, a man with graying hair and polished armor, saw only a threat. He raised his arm, and his voice, distorted by the magical amplifier, became hard and cold. "Enough of your lies, monster. You will be destroyed, and Lumbria will belong to humans again, not beasts." Behind him, the warriors raised their swords and spears, and the horses reared under the soldiers' cries. Suddenly, as one living force, the army surged toward her, a sea of metal and will. Elian remained still, hesitating, her hands still raised, but when the first sword swung at her ankles, she pulled her foot back, sending a tremor through the earth. She felt a faint sting, but no real pain. She looked down and saw the tiny soldiers striking at her skin as if they were hitting stone. She bent down, her hair flowing across the battlefield like a veil. The bravest soldiers tried to strike her palm or her shins, but nothing pierced her, only small, cold pricks. She straightened, and a faint smile spread across her lips, first puzzled, then playful. "You cannot hurt me," she whispered, almost apologetically. She gently placed her hand in front of her like a wall and softly pushed the soldiers away, sending them tumbling across the grass without injury. All around her, the army continued its attack, but it quickly became clear that nothing could harm her. She carefully lifted a group of knights into the air with her hand, let them dangle above the ground, then set them back down as she laughed softly and carefully. "You have no reason to fear," she said, gentle yet proud. "I will not fight you, but I will not allow you to destroy my home." The army retreated uneasily, their courage beginning to crumble beneath the immense being who neither struck back nor showed anger, yet stood unshaken, as if nothing in the world could bring her down. The general continued shouting in rage, but even his soldiers began to hesitate. In the midst of the night's chaos stood Elian, larger, stronger, and calmer than ever before. In her smile there was both sorrow and playfulness, a quiet understanding of her own power, and a newfound certainty. She could no longer be harmed by swords or fear. But behind her eyes, another thought was growing. What now? Would they ever see her as anything other than a monster? The battle was over, but the transformation had only just begun. Chapter 9. When hunger takes over, it began almost imperceptibly. Elian stood in the middle of the field, surrounded by torches, shouting, and panicked soldiers, pushing them aside like toys, gently, controlled, with arms and feet that merely moved them out of the way. She did not want to hurt anyone. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture restrained. But something changed. It came like a cold slide down her spine, at the same time as her stomach clenched in a deep, violent, cramping pull. A sound rolled out of her, low, deep, almost plaintive, and the entire battlefield could hear it. The ground vibrated faintly beneath her feet. Elian froze, completely still. The soldiers stopped, some mid-step, others with weapons raised. They looked up. She stood there, unmoving, head slightly lowered, one hand half raised as if to say stop. "Wait," she said. Her voice was different now, heavier, pressured. "Stop, please. I can feel something wrong." She clutched her stomach, fingers tightening against the fabric that still grew with her, but now felt tight as if it were trying to hold something back. The hunger struck again, not like before, not just a rumble. It was a wave, a force, an urge that surged through her and blurred her vision. She looked down. The soldiers, the torches, the movement. Something in her gaze changed. Elian took a step back as if trying to flee from herself. "Go away," she said quickly. "All of you. I mean it. Go away." But the army's general did not heed the warning. He saw only her hesitation and shouted new orders. More soldiers advanced, more weapons were raised. That was when it snapped. The hunger exploded. It was as if a light inside her was switched off. Not completely, but enough that the world lost its colors. The sounds became distant, small, insignificant. She no longer felt the grass beneath her feet, only the pulse in her own chest and the burning, all-consuming emptiness in her stomach. Elian's eyes darkened. Her breathing grew deep, slow, heavy. She straightened, fully upright, and the shadow of her body fell like a wall across the battlefield. The soldiers felt it, not like wind, but like weight, as if the very air pressed down on them. "No," she whispered, but the word was drowned by her next breath. She moved again, faster now, less careful. A single step made several soldiers fall. An arm swung out, not in anger but in instinct, and sent an entire line of soldiers tumbling through the grass. Not dead, not crushed, but terrified, helpless. Inside her, something still screamed, "Stop. That's me. That's Elian." But the hunger answered louder. It whispered they were small, that there were many of them, that she was big, that she did not need to be afraid. A faint, alien smile slid across her lips. Not playful now, not warm, just empty. She stopped again, head slightly tilted, as if she were studying the battlefield anew. Not as a home, but as a place she no longer understood. Far behind her, shouts rose from Lumbria. General Gavin's voice, desperate, barely audible in the chaos. "Elian, look at me! It's you! Fight it!" She heard him, but she could not answer. Because in that moment, it was no longer just a battle against an army. It was a battle against something inside herself that was waking fully. And if no one stopped it soon, the next step would no longer be defense. Chapter 10. The Voice That Was Not Hers. Elian turned slowly, not Shangri-La, just empty. Her enormous body moved as if pulled by something other than will. Her eyes swept over the battlefield and found General Gavin. Her gaze settled on him, but there was no recognition in it, only a cold, alien assessment. "You don't need to be afraid," she said. The voice was hers, and yet not. It was soft, almost comforting, but something was wrong beneath the words, like an echo from a deep, dark chamber. "They have come to kill you all," she continued calmly. "They will burn the city, kill the children, your families." She took a step forward. The ground sank beneath the weight. "If I just take them away," she said slowly, "if I just eat them, then you will never have to fear them again." General Gavin's heart pounded so hard he felt it in his throat. Knights around him shouted. Some retreated, others froze. But before anyone could react, Elian moved her hand. Not violently, not brutally, just with certainty. An entire group of soldiers, and among them the foreign general in heavy armor, was lifted from the ground as if they were nothing more than pieces on a board. They screamed, struggled, but her fingers closed around them like a gentle trap. She raised her hand in front of her face. The foreign general hung in her grasp, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. Elian studied him closely, like a child examining something new. Her tongue briefly slid across her lips, slowly, unconsciously, and her breathing deepened. "See," the voice said again. So small, so easy to remove. She opened her mouth slightly, and there, right there, it happened. "Elian!" General Gavin ran, not away, not to hide. He ran straight toward her. People screamed. Someone shouted his name, but he did not stop. He reached her leg, her enormous thigh rising like a wall of fabric and warmth before him. He placed both hands against her, so close that her skin filled his entire world. He was not afraid. "This is not you," he shouted, his voice hoarse but clear. "Look at me. I'm here. I've always been here." Elian froze. The hand before her face trembled slightly. "You are not a monster," Gavin continued, now so close that her shadow completely swallowed him. "You are the girl who cried when someone was hurt. You are the one who shared your bread even when you were hungry yourself. You love your people. You love us." Inside Elian, something began to crack. Images flooded in, children laughing in her hand, the city bathed in sunlight, her own vow never to harm those she was meant to protect. The dark voice hissed again, pressing in. "They are small. They are dangerous. You don't need to feel anymore. Just do it." But it was weaker now. Like a whisper in the wind, Elian's eyes filled with tears. Her voice broke. The alien tone vanished, replaced by something fragile. Real. I don't want to be this." The hand before her face slowly lowered. The captured soldiers were set down, hard, chaotic, but alive. The foreign general collapsed to his knees in shock. Elian drew in a long, shaking breath, and tears began to fall again, huge as raindrops, but filled with guilt and relief. "I was so close," she whispered. "I could feel it. It felt so easy." General Gavin pressed his forehead against her leg, his voice low. "But you didn't do it. And that's what matters." The dark voice tried one last time, weak, distant, and then silence. Elian sank to her knees, the whole world trembling gently as she did. She wrapped her arms around herself, enormous and broken, but herself again. She was still hungry, still dangerous, but she was Elian. And as long as someone dared to stand at her side, even in her shadow, she was not lost. Chapter 11, Not Today. Elian collapsed, letting her legs fold beneath her as she slowly lay down on the meadow. Her body stretched across the grass like a small hill in the landscape, and she pressed both hands against her stomach. Her skin was damp with sweat, her eyes glassy with hunger. She looked down at General Gavin, who stood faithfully at her side, his face filled with worry, yet softened by compassion. I'm so hungry, Gavin. I feel like I'm going to die soon." Her voice was fragile, low, almost a whisper carried by the wind. He reached up as far as he could and let his hand rest against her finger. "You're holding on, Elian. You've endured all of this. We're almost there now. I know you can do it." Around them stood the soldiers, no longer in attack formation, but with sorrow and doubt in their eyes. Before, they had feared her, been angry, but now, seeing her tears and her weakness, they could not help but feel for her. Several lowered their swords, others stepped back and looked down, as if the shame of their own thoughts had become too heavy to bear. The foreign general, still flushed with rage, suddenly shouted, "Now! She's lying down! Attack! For Lumbria! For the kingdom!" His voice thundered across the field, but no one moved. Instead, one by one, soldiers began throwing their weapons down before Elian. Swords, spears, and bows fell into the grass with a clatter, like rain against stone. "We won't do it," came voices from all sides. "She's not a monster. She saved us." The general's face turned purple with fury. He grabbed his sword, raised it above his head, and charged forward himself, screaming in madness. But suddenly the sword slipped from his hand, as if the wind itself had seized it. He tried to grab it, but it drifted away, as if pulled by an invisible thread, and with a sharp crack it struck him at the temple, knocking him unconscious to the ground. Everyone stared in astonishment. Silence fell, broken only by Elian's heavy breathing. Then, out of the shadows, an old man came walking forward. He was bent like a branch, clad in a tattered cloak, his beard white as snow, and every step creaked as if his bones refused to cooperate. He stopped beside General Gavin and looked up at Elian, his eyes glinting with a mischievous smile. "Not today," he said, his voice crisp and teasing. "There's already been quite enough trouble." He laughed, a crooked, creaking laugh, and raised his staff, which immediately shimmered with magical light. My name is Armandus. I believe I am the one you have been waiting for. My apologies for arriving a little earlier than planned. It's difficult to walk quickly when one is older than the kingdom itself. Everyone, even the enemy soldiers, now stared in confusion at the small, ancient wizard who stood like an anchor in the midst of chaos. Gavin let out a breath of relief. Elian breathed a little deeper, her eyes filling with hope. Armandus stepped a little closer, flicked the remaining soldiers away with a snap of his fingers, and looked up at Elian. Well then, my girl, shall we see if we can rid you of that hunger and make you yourself again? A smile, faint but genuine, spread across Elian's lips for the first time in a long while. At last, in the midst of chaos and hunger, a light of hope was kindled. Chapter 12, The Wizard's Trial. The old wizard Armandus drew a deep breath and looked around at the people. His gaze moved from the soldiers to Elian and finally to General Gavin, who stood ready for both battle and explanation. Now you must tell me exactly what happened, Armandus said, his voice kind yet commanding. Gavin stepped forward. It began when Elian opened a mysterious package and found a crystal. When she touched it, she began to grow. We hid the crystal, but it... Armandus raised his hand and Gavin's words died away. A crystal, you say? The wizard closed his eyes and lifted his staff. The air hummed faintly, and suddenly there was a loud clashing boom, like lightning striking a mountain. Something rushed through the air and landed in Armandus's hand with a flash. The crystal that had started it all. Gavin stepped back, his heart pounding. You shouldn't touch it. But Armandus laughed softly and waved the crystal, which glowed faintly in his hand. Don't worry, my boy. This kind of magic only works on the one it has chosen. To me, it's just a stone. He shook it lightly, as if trying to wake it, then looked over at Elian. Are you ready, my girl? Elian, still exhausted and hollow, nodded slowly. If you can help me, then yes. I just want to be myself again. The wizard smiled, his eyes sparkling with wisdom and mischief. It will feel strange. For all of you, the magic binds itself to the entire place, not just one soul. Just trust me. Gavin frowned. Strange? What do you mean, all of us? Armandus placed the crystal against the ground and raised his staff high. Hold on. Close your eyes if you dare. A flashing golden light leapt from the staff to the crystal, and at once the entire meadow, the entire battlefield, was wrapped in a glow so intense that the world itself seemed to vanish. Everything turned dark, not like night, but like falling into a dream where weight and time and body were undone. Elian felt the warmth spread through her, but it was not the same uncontrolled force as before, more like an embrace that drew her deep into herself. She felt herself drifting, felt her thoughts mingle with those of the city's people, as if she could hear their hopes, fears, and love through a veil. Everything became light, and then it became quiet. Chapter 13, A New Dawn. The light fell gently through the tall windows, and for a moment Elian thought she was still dreaming. She opened her eyes, felt the fabric beneath her, and instantly recognized her bed, her own bed, with the finely embroidered pillows and the blanket she herself had chosen. The room smelled of lavender and sunlight, just as it always had. She sat up, felt a strange lightness in her body, and everything was normal. Not the slightest trace of hunger, no heaviness, no roaring emptiness. She lifted her hand and studied her fingers. Everything was as it had been before. Her confusion grew. She slid out of bed, her feet touching the soft carpet, and hurried to the window. Outside, the city stretched out, Lumbria, bathed in sunlight and a cool morning breeze. People walked across the square, greeting one another. Children ran playfully between the stalls. There were no ruins, no giant shadows, no fear. Everything looked as it always had, as if her nightmare had never taken place. She touched her head, trying to gather her thoughts, when a gentle voice sounded behind her. Welcome back, my princess. Elian turned quickly, and there, in the doorway, stood Armandus, the wizard. His old figure looked even more crooked in the soft morning light, but his eyes sparkled with wisdom. What happened? Was it all just a dream? She asked carefully, her voice trembling. He smiled, a hint of wariness in his expression. No, princess, it was not a dream. It was real. All of it. But when I broke the crystal's magic, I used my greatest gift, time. I pulled the world back to the moment before you opened the package. Everything you experienced, all the terrible and wondrous things, only the two of us remember them now. Elian took a deep breath, looked down at her hands, and felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. But why? What was that crystal? Why? Why did it happen to me? Armandus's smile faded and his gaze grew heavy. He stepped closer, his voice lowered and serious. That crystal was no accident, Elian. There exists a man, not an ordinary human, but a wanderer between worlds. He plays with destinies, sending curses and gifts across universes, always at random, always without warning. He turns women into giants, transforms lives, simply to see what happens. Elian's eyes widened. Why does he do it? Can he be stopped? Armandus shook his head, a trace of sorrow in his voice. We try. Wizards everywhere, across many worlds, have tried to catch him, to stop his games, but he is always one step ahead, always hidden in the shadows. All I could do was undo the damage and protect you, so you may have a life without fear. Silence settled in the room. Sunlight danced across the walls, birds sang outside. Elian looked up at him, her gaze filled with questions, but Armandus gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You do not need to carry the memory of what happened, my princess. Some adventures are too heavy for a human heart. Remember only the love and the strength from today, and forget the rest. He smiled again, this time with something safe and caring in his expression. With a small tap of his staff, the world began to spin before her eyes, and slowly everything grew hazy. When Elian opened her eyes again, she was still sitting in her bed. The sunlight streamed in, and the city outside buzzed with life. She felt happy, light, and completely without fear, as if a great weight had been lifted away. The adventure was over, or perhaps it was only beginning anew. For even though she could no longer remember everything, she had gained a new calm in her heart, and a small trace of magic that might one day awaken again.